can't predict every eventuality, but what you need is a very solid decision-making framework to help the board, the management, understand their risk, reward, and potential scenarios.
Hello, I'm John Generone, Editor-in-Chief of IPO Edge and CorpGov. Thrilled to be back here at Nasdaq Market Site in New York City. I've got with us today our old friend Ira Gorsky, who's a Managing Director at Edelman Smithfield, and we're going to talk about crisis communications. Ira, thanks for joining.
Happy to be here.
So, Ira, introduce people who are not familiar with what crisis communications is. What does that mean?
So there's a lot of different issues that companies come across. It could be anywhere from a CEO getting into trouble, something that they shouldn't have done, a board coup where they need to force people out, and then there's potentially communications related to it. Could be a crisis in their brand, could be an industrial accident, could be some sort of accusation, could be something where their stock price is falling because of a short attack. And then we have to sort through that part. So it could be a very wide range, but essentially from our standpoint, it's the approach in decision making, because you can't predict every eventuality, but what you need is a very solid decision-making framework to help the board, the management, understand their risk, reward, and potential scenarios.
Gotcha. And now, just going off script if I can a little bit here, Ira, there are a lot of stakeholders whom you need to reach through your communication, right? I mean, we're thinking shareholders most of the time, right? But a lot of times employees are really important too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So from my prior career as a trader, that's how I wound up doing crisis when I came to Edelman. It's because you'd have public companies that are in a crisis.
Yeah.
So there would be a limited amount of information that's in the public domain. The stock price automatically reacts, and then I would jump in and say, here's how investors are going to react. Here's the information that they're looking for. Here are the parameters of what you can and cannot say, because one of the things that companies don't want to do is they don't want to say something that turns out to be incorrect later because it undermines their credibility. But now that I'm on this side, behind the curtain, with inside information, I can see that here's what you need to tell employees. Here's also what customers are worried about. If there's something that's potentially a contagion, that you don't want one element unrelated to now taint the brand.
Yeah.
And then your vendors and your partners are people you've got to work with as well.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, it's important to have a plan, right? And should the plan depend on the industry you're in or the kind of company you are? I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here. If I'm a restaurant, maybe I'd like to have a foodborne illness plan, that kind of thing. Do you customize them?
Yeah, and so you think about it, from a top-down standpoint. So one of the first things you have to do is the decision-making mechanism. That's why we refer to these as peacetime plans, because you can't start figuring out who the decision makers are in the midst of a crisis.
Yeah.
It's very similar to the work we do on activism defense.
Yeah.
If you have an activist in your stock making moves, making statements, you can't start moving at the same speed that they do. So crises move at a speed that is beyond what normal boards and management could do. So you need a contingency plan in place that says who's going to be informed, what the escalation protocol will be, and then that's how you work it out. But then to your point about what's specific, do you have a retail component? Is it a brand? Do you have some regulator sensitivity if you're a utility?
Yeah.
And then you've got some issue that you've got to deal with.
I got you. Now, who should be familiar with this playbook? Should the whole board of directors be familiar with it, before the bad day comes?
Ideally, you should socialize it with the board. So it starts with the communications people, investor relations people, then the senior management above them, the C-suite.
Yeah.
Then it's important, ideally, if a company is really on top of it, they will do a tabletop exercise.
Yeah.
Because they're going to, the part that I think companies always don't fully appreciate till they're in it is how imperfect the information they get is.
Yeah.
So when there's a scenario or a playbook and they say, this is what happens, what do you do? The real thing is, this event occurred, we don't know.
Yeah.
Like, so for example, if you have a CEO transition problem and a CEO transition plan and the CEO is in an accident, are they incapacitated?
Yeah.
Are they conscious? what's their recovery time, as opposed to CEO's dead, who's the new CEO.
Right.
Like there's a lot more ambiguity that you've got to work through.
Now, we're generally thinking, first and foremost, of public companies. We're talking about this, but this can apply to non-public entities as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And non-public companies still have to deal with the same issues, except for they don't see their stock trade. They still have investors, they still have employees, they have bank lines, they have bad press, reputational harm. All of those things still occur. And on the private equity side, there's a whole range of portfolio companies, and a lot of the things that we do, which I think is helpful to our clients, is for the GPs, we help them with, here's a plan, and then they say, uh-oh, one of our portfolio companies has an issue,
Yeah.
we need you to jump in and help out with that.
Gotcha, makes sense. Now, you just alluded to your experience in the buy side, which I think is really interesting to get into. I want to ask you how that experience translates to the way you look at news, the way you look at media. You know, I remember when you used to be a source of mine 15 years ago and I was the Journal, you know, you would tell me, yeah, John, if you or the Bloomberg publish something, it's pretty much rock solid, but there's a lot of other information floating around that can move markets.
Yeah, so there's the influencer element. So if there's crises that I've worked on that are brand-based, and if all of a sudden you have a retail product and you've got an influencer trashing your product, there's no informational standard they have to adhere to.
Yeah.
So then you've got to figure out the situation. So that's a little different. From an investor standpoint, for publicly traded companies, there's an expression in PR, I didn't come up with the expression, which is, if it feels good, it's probably not the right decision. and that usually comes, you know, I always say that when it comes with short sellers.
Yeah.
Someone attacks my stock, you want to, you know, the C-suite wants to come out guns blazing, say, this is, you know, they're a fraud, this is, you know, they're manipulating the market, but from an investor standpoint, you've got to get to the facts quickly. That's not going to change people's opinion by yelling at your short seller.
Right, makes sense. And now, what would you tell a CEO who says, oh my gosh, there's all this chatter out there on Reddit and X, you know, just saying these negative things, how can I stop them? I mean, if there's a single source of that noise, it's a little bit easier, but if you've got dozens of people doing it, what advice do you give?
So for those, given that we've had such, I mean broadly, been an uptick in the digital world, a lot of this is manufactured disinformation.
Yeah.
We actually, at Edelman, we have someone within the firm that we partner with, former military intelligence,
Wow.
who does counter disinformation. So there are patterns that you can recognize in disinformation and then figure out plans of how to push back against it.
Wow, that's some next level stuff. All right, well, Ira, let's leave it there. This has been Ira Gorsky, our good friend from Edelman Smithfield. I'm John Janarone, Editor-in-Chief of IPO Edge and Corp Gov, signing off from a Nasdaq market site here in New York City.